My daughter-in-law humiliated me in front of the CEO's meeting. You don't even have a diploma, grab a broom and get to work. But when the Arab sheikh realized I spoke 8 languages, her face turned pale instantly. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm Maureen, and at 60 years old, I thought I'd experienced every kind of heartbreak life could offer. I was wrong. The worst pain came from the person who should have been family, in front of a room full of strangers who would judge me for the rest of my life. The conference room at the Marriott downtown was pristine, all glass and marble, the kind of place where important decisions get made by important people. My son David had insisted I come to this networking event for CEOs and business leaders. Mom, you need to get out more, he'd said. Meadow thinks it would be good for you to see how the business world really works. Meadow, my daughter-in-law of 8 years, who never missed an opportunity to remind me that I didn't belong in her world. She was everything I wasn't, blonde, polished, with an MBA from some fancy school whose name she dropped in every conversation. At 35, she commanded rooms with her confidence, her designer suits, her ability to speak the language of quarterly reports and market projections. I sat quietly at our table, wearing my best dress, a navy blue one I'd bought at Macy's 3 years ago during their clearance sale. Around me, conversations flowed about mergers, acquisitions, international expansions. I understood more than they thought, but I'd learned long ago to keep my mouth shut. Nobody wanted to hear what the old lady had to say. The keynote speaker was introducing the evening's special guest, Sheikh Rashid Al Mansouri, a prominent businessman from Dubai who was looking to expand his operations in the United States. He was an elegant man in his 50s, with kind eyes and an air of quiet authority that commanded respect without demanding it. That's when Meadow decided to make her move. "Oh, Sheikh Al Mansouri," she said, rising from her seat with that practiced smile she reserved for networking events. "I'm Meadow Patterson, CEO of Patterson Digital Solutions. This is my husband David, and this is..." She paused, looking at me with barely concealed disdain. "This is Maureen, David's mother." The way she said it made me sound like an afterthought, a piece of furniture that happened to be taking up space at their table. Sheikh Al Mansouri nodded politely in my direction, but before he could respond, Meadow continued. "Maureen doesn't really understand business," she said with a laugh that cut through me like glass. "She never went to college, you know. Never even finished high school, actually. We've been trying to find her something to do with her time, maybe some volunteer work, though I'm not sure what skills she could offer." I felt my cheeks burn. The conversations at nearby tables had quieted, and I could feel eyes turning toward us. Sheikh Al Mansouri's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read crossing his features. "Now, Meadow," David said weakly, but he didn't defend me. He never did. Somewhere along the way, my son had stopped being my little boy and become someone who was embarrassed by where he came from, but Meadow wasn't finished. She was enjoying herself now, feeding off the attention, the way she always did when she found an opportunity to elevate herself by diminishing someone else. "Honestly," she continued, her voice carrying across the room, "I don't know why we brought her. She doesn't have a diploma to hang on the wall, no professional experience to speak of. Maybe she should just grab a broom and go find some real work, instead of pretending to understand conversations she's not qualified to participate in." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt something break inside my chest, not just from the cruelty of her words, but from the public nature of the humiliation. These people, successful, educated, accomplished people, were now looking at me like I was exactly what Meadow had painted me to be. A burden, an embarrassment, someone who didn't belong. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to stand up and walk out, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Instead, I sat there, staring at my hands folded in my lap, feeling smaller than I had in years. What Meadow didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her words had just awakened something in me that I'd buried for decades. She thought she knew who I was, thought she understood my story based on the surface-level version I'd allowed them to see. But some stories run deeper than appearances suggest, and some people carry more than others will ever realize. As I sat there in that suffocating silence, feeling the weight of their judgment and Meadow's satisfaction, I made a decision. I wouldn't give her the reaction she wanted. I wouldn't cry, wouldn't defend myself, wouldn't create the scene she was hoping for. Instead, I would remember who I used to be before life forced me to become small and invisible. The conversation moved on eventually, as conversations do, but the damage was done. I could feel the shift in how people looked at me for the rest of the evening, when they looked at me at all. I had become what Meadow intended, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when you don't have the right credentials or the right connections. But as I watched Sheikh al-Mansouri throughout the evening, I noticed something that gave me hope. While others had moved on from the awkward moment, he kept glancing in my direction, not with pity or dismissal, but with something that looked almost like curiosity, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. Little did any of them know that some puzzles, once solved, change everything. The drive home from the conference was silent, except for the hum of David's luxury sedan and the occasional sigh from Meadow as she scrolled through her phone, probably updating her social media about the important networking event she'd just attended. I stared out the window at the passing streetlights, each one a reminder of how far I'd traveled from the life I once knew. "That went well," Meadow said finally, not looking up from her phone. "I think Sheikh al-Mansouri was impressed with our company's growth projections." David mumbled something in agreement, but I could feel his discomfort in the tension of his shoulders, the way his grip tightened on the steering wheel. He knew what his wife had done was wrong, but he'd never had the backbone to stand up to her. Not about me, anyway. When they dropped me off at my small apartment, the one-bedroom place I'd moved to after David got married because it would be better for everyone if I had my own space, I sat in my living room surrounded by the modest furniture I'd accumulated over the years and let myself remember. I remembered being 28 years old, standing in the kitchen of our suburban home, watching the morning news with my husband Robert while 6-year-old David ate his cereal at the kitchen table. Robert was getting ready for his job at the accounting firm, adjusting his tie in that careful way he had when the phone rang, the call that changed everything. The woman's voice on the other end was professional but gentle, the kind of tone reserved for delivering devastating news. There had been an accident. A drunk driver had run a red light during Robert's lunch break. He was gone before the paramedics arrived. In the space of one phone call, I went from being a wife and mother living comfortably in middle-class America to being a widow with no life insurance, no savings to speak of, and a mountain of medical bills that Robert's insurance wouldn't cover. The accounting firm expressed their condolences and explained that as a contract employee, Robert hadn't been eligible for the company's death benefits. I'd been 3 semesters away from finishing my degree in international relations when David was born. Robert and I had agreed I'd go back to school once he started kindergarten, but now there was no money for tuition, no time for classes, and no luxury of planning for the future. There was only survival. The first job I could find was cleaning offices downtown. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but it was work I could do in the evenings after David went to bed. I'd drop him off at the neighbor's house at 9 p.m., work until 6 a.m., then come home to get him ready for school. We survived on peanut butter sandwiches and canned soup, but we survived. I remember David at 8 years old, asking why I was always tired, why we couldn't go to McDonald's like his friends, why I fell asleep during his school plays. I remember the guilt that ate at me every day, knowing that while other mothers were helping with homework and attending PTA meetings, I was scrubbing toilets in empty office buildings just to keep our lights on. By the time David was 12, I'd worked my way up to a supervisor position with the cleaning company. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough for us to move to a slightly better apartment, and for me to buy David the name brand sneakers he desperately wanted. I told myself it was temporary, that once he graduated high school, I'd find a way to go back to school myself. But then David got accepted to college with a partial scholarship, and the partial wasn't enough. The choice was simple: use what little savings I'd managed to accumulate for his education, or watch him miss his chance at the future I'd never been able to secure for myself. There was no choice at all, really. I worked 3 jobs during David's college years: the cleaning company during the week, a grocery store on weekends, and occasional catering gigs whenever I could find them. I wore the same 3 outfits in rotation and learned to make 1 bag of groceries last a week. When David called home, I told him everything was fine, that I was proud of him, that he should focus on his studies and not worry about anything else. He graduated with honors and landed a good job in tech. I cried the day he called to tell me about his first paycheck. More money in 2 weeks than I made in 2 months. Finally, I thought, we'd made it. He could help me now. Maybe I could finally slow down. Maybe even think about that degree again. That's when he met Meadow. She was everything I wasn't: sophisticated, educated, confident in her place in the world. She had opinions about restaurants I'd never heard of, vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines, and a way of making it clear that David's humble beginnings were something to be overcome, not honored. The first time David brought her home, she looked around my small apartment with barely concealed distaste. "It's so cozy," she said, which I quickly learned was Meadow speak for disappointing. When she asked about my background, I made the mistake of being honest about my work, my lack of formal education, the choices I'd made to support David's dreams. "How noble," she said, but the word sounded like an insult coming from her lips. Within 6 months, David was different. He stopped calling as often, stopped visiting unless Meadow was traveling for work. When he did come by, he seemed embarrassed by my furniture, my neighborhood, my stories about work. Meadow had convinced him that his past was holding him back, and unfortunately, I was part of that past. Their wedding was elegant and expensive, held at a country club where I knew exactly 3 people: David, Meadow, and Meadow's mother, who introduced me to other guests as David's mother who works in maintenance. I spent most of the reception sitting alone at a table near the kitchen, watching my son dance with his new wife and wondering when I'd become a stranger in his life. In the 8 years since then, I'd become what Meadow needed me to be: grateful for their occasional acknowledgement, apologetic for taking up space, invisible unless they needed something. I attended holidays when invited, babysat their dog when they traveled, and accepted their charity with the appropriate amount of humility. But tonight, sitting in my quiet apartment with Meadow's words still echoing in my head, I felt something shift. Maybe it was the way Sheikh Al-Mansouri had looked at me, not with pity, but with interest. Maybe it was the realization that I'd spent so many years making myself small that I'd forgotten I was ever anything else. I walked to my bedroom closet and reached behind the winter coats I rarely needed in our mild climate. There, in a battered cardboard box, were the remnants of who I used to be: letters written in languages Meadow didn't know I spoke, photographs from places she'd never imagined I'd been, certificates and documents that told a story completely different from the one she'd written for me. As I held these pieces of my past, I realized that Meadow's cruelty tonight might have been the gift I didn't know I needed. She'd pushed me so far down that I'd finally hit something solid, something she couldn't touch or diminish or explain away. I was about to remember who I really was, and that knowledge was going to change everything. 3 days after the humiliation at the conference, I was doing what I always did when the world felt too heavy. I was working. Not the prestigious kind of work that Meadow respected, but the honest labor that had kept David and me afloat for so many years. I was cleaning the offices at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized law firm downtown where I'd worked evening shifts for the past 5 years. I'd just finished vacuuming the conference room when I heard voices coming from the main lobby. It wasn't unusual for lawyers to work late, but something about the conversation made me pause. One voice was speaking Arabic, classical Arabic, not the simplified version most people learned in college courses. Curiosity got the better of me. I wheeled my cart closer to the reception area, staying out of sight behind the tall plants that decorated the lobby. That's when I saw him, Sheikh Rashid Al-Mansouri, standing near the elevator with Harold Morrison, the senior partner of the firm. "I appreciate you meeting with me so late," Sheikh Al-Mansouri was saying in English. "The time difference with Dubai makes these conversations challenging." "Not a problem at all," Morrison replied. "We understand the complexities of international business. Though I have to admit, Some of the cultural nuances in your contracts are beyond my expertise. Sheikh al-Mansouri nodded thoughtfully. Yes, the language barriers can be significant. Even professional translators sometimes miss the subtle implications of certain phrases. Legal translation requires not just linguistic knowledge, but cultural understanding that goes back centuries. That's when I heard Miguel, the night janitor who'd been working these offices for 15 years, approaching with his cart. He was from El Salvador and spoke limited English, but he was a kind man who always greeted me warmly in Spanish. "Buenas noches, señora Maureen," he said as he passed by. "Buenas noches, Miguel. ¿Cómo está su familia?" I replied, asking about his family as I always did. Sheikh al-Mansouri's head turned sharply at the sound of our conversation. I saw him excuse himself from Morrison and walk toward the reception area where Miguel and I stood. "Forgive me," he said, approaching us with genuine curiosity rather than the dismissive attitude I'd expected. "I couldn't help but notice your Spanish. Your accent is quite refined. Castilian influence, perhaps?" I felt my cheeks warm, suddenly conscious of my cleaning uniform and the vacuum cleaner cord draped over my arm. Yes, I lived in Spain for several years when I was younger." "Fascinating," he said, and I could tell he meant it. "Your pronunciation suggests formal education, not casual exposure." Miguel looked between us, confused by the conversation happening around him. I smiled at him and said in Spanish, "Go ahead and finish the east wing. I'll take care of the lobby." Sheikh al-Mansouri's eyebrows raised slightly. "Your Spanish is exceptional. Where did you study?" Before I could answer, Harold Morrison appeared behind the sheikh, clearly impatient to continue their business discussion. "Rashid, we should probably get back to reviewing those contracts." But Sheikh al-Mansouri seemed reluctant to end our conversation. "One moment, Harold." He turned back to me. "I'm curious about something. When you lived in Spain, did you have occasion to learn any Arabic?" The question caught me off guard. Most people didn't make the connection between Spain's Moorish history and the Arabic influence on the language, but Sheikh al-Mansouri clearly understood the linguistic heritage. "Some," I said carefully. "The architecture and history of Andalusia are difficult to truly appreciate without understanding the Arabic roots." I saw something shift in his expression, a sharpening of attention that made me suddenly aware that this wasn't casual small talk. "Would you indulge me?" he asked. "Could you tell me what you think of this phrase?" He spoke a sentence in Arabic, not the modern dialect most people learned, but classical Arabic with the formal structure used in legal and diplomatic contexts. Without thinking, I responded in the same dialect, explaining that he was referencing an old Quranic verse about justice and fairness in business dealings, and that it was often quoted in traditional contract negotiations to establish good faith between parties. The silence that followed was profound. Harold Morrison looked confused. Miguel was staring at me like I'd just performed magic, and Sheikh al-Mansouri's face had gone completely still. "Where?" he said slowly. "Did you learn to speak classical Arabic with a Syrian diplomatic accent?" My heart started pounding. I'd slipped. In 3 sentences, I'd revealed knowledge that didn't fit with the story everyone believed about me. The story I'd allowed them to believe, because it was easier than explaining the truth. I started, then stopped. Harold Morrison was checking his watch impatiently, and I was suddenly aware that I was a janitor having an impromptu linguistics discussion with one of the most influential businessmen in the Middle East. "I should get back to work," I said, reaching for my vacuum. "Wait," Sheikh al-Mansouri said, his voice carrying an authority that made both Morrison and me freeze. "Mrs." He paused, realizing he didn't know my name. "Maureen?" I said quietly. "Maureen Sullivan. Mrs. Sullivan, I have a question for you." He turned to Morrison. "Harold, would you mind giving us a moment? This is important." Morrison looked annoyed but nodded and walked back toward his office. Miguel, sensing the tension, quickly moved his cart to the far end of the lobby. Sheikh al-Mansouri stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need you to understand something. The Arabic you just spoke to me, the dialect, the formal structure, the cultural context you referenced, that's not something you learn from books or casual study. That's the Arabic of diplomatic families, of people who grew up in embassy compounds and international schools. I felt the walls I'd built around my past beginning to crumble. This man was too perceptive, too knowledgeable about the world I'd come from to accept the simple explanations that satisfied everyone else. The other night, he continued, at the networking event. Your daughter-in-law said you never finished high school, that you had no professional experience, but I've been thinking about you since then. There was something about the way you carried yourself, the way you listened to our conversation about international business. You understood things that most MBA graduates wouldn't catch. I looked down at my hands, still gripping the vacuum handle like a lifeline. You're mistaken. I'm just a cleaning lady who's picked up a few languages over the years. Are you? He asked gently. Because I've spent my entire life in international business, Mrs. Sullivan. I know the difference between someone who's learned languages as a hobby and someone who's lived them. You didn't just learn Arabic, you lived somewhere where classical Arabic was the language of education and diplomacy. Am I right? The kindness in his voice was almost harder to bear than Meadows' cruelty had been. Cruelty I could deflect, could armor myself against. But genuine interest in who I really was, that was dangerous territory I hadn't navigated in decades. I should go, I said again, but my voice sounded weak even to myself. Mrs. Sullivan, Sheikh al-Mansouri said, I'm going to be in the city for the rest of the week, working on some business contracts that require very specific cultural and linguistic expertise, the kind of expertise that's apparently very rare in this country. Would you be willing to have coffee with me tomorrow? As a consultant, not as. He gestured gently toward my uniform. Whatever role you're playing here. I stared at him, my mind racing. This was exactly what I'd spent years avoiding. Someone seeing through the careful simplicity I'd built around myself. But there was something in his eyes that wasn't pity or curiosity for its own sake. It was recognition, as if he knew what it was like to be more than people assumed you were. I don't think that would be appropriate, I said finally. Why not? He asked. Because of what your family believes about you? Or because you've forgotten what you're capable of? The question hit like a physical blow, cutting straight through to the truth I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it wasn't real. Think about it, he said, pulling a business card from his pocket and setting it on the reception desk. I'll be at the Ritz-Carlton lobby at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. If you decide you're tired of pretending to be less than you are, I'll be there. He turned to leave, then paused. And Mrs. Sullivan, what your daughter-in-law said about you the other night, about not being qualified to participate in conversations you don't understand? She's wrong. You understand more than any of them do. The question is whether you're ready to remember that. As he walked away, I stood in the quiet lobby, staring at his business card, and feeling like I was standing at a crossroads I'd never expected to see again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my small kitchen, staring at Sheikh al-Mansouri's business card and the box of memories I'd pulled from my closet. By 5 a.m., I'd made my decision. I called in sick to my day job, something I hadn't done in 3 years, and spent the morning getting ready for a conversation I'd avoided for 2 decades. At exactly 10 a.m., I walked into the Ritz-Carlton lobby wearing my one good dress and carrying a small leather portfolio I hadn't touched since David's high school graduation. Sheikh al-Mansouri was already there, sitting in a quiet corner with 2 cups of coffee and a stack of documents. Mrs. Sullivan, he said, rising to greet me. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. Neither was I admitted, sitting across from him and accepting the coffee with hands that trembled slightly. He studied me for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. Tell me about Syria. The directness of the question took my breath away. What makes you think I know anything about Syria? Because last night, you spoke Arabic with a Damascus accent that you can only acquire by living there during your formative years. And because when I mentioned classical Arabic, you immediately referenced the legal and diplomatic traditions that most people wouldn't know unless they'd been part of that world. I took a sip of coffee, buying time while my mind raced. You're very perceptive. It's my job to be. I've built my business on reading people, understanding cultures, recognizing value that others might miss. He paused. The question is, why are you hiding yours? I opened the leather portfolio and pulled out a photograph, one I hadn't looked at in years. It showed a young woman in her early 20s, standing in front of the American embassy in Damascus. She was wearing a professional suit, holding a folder of documents, smiling with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Sheikh Al-Mansouri picked up the photograph, studying it carefully. "That's you." 38 years ago, I said. I was 22, fresh out of Georgetown with a degree in international relations and a specialty in Middle Eastern studies. My father was a career diplomat, and I'd grown up in embassy compounds in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. And the languages? Arabic, French, Spanish, German, Italian, Portuguese, and Farsi. I said, the list feeling strange on my tongue after so many years of hiding it. When you grow up moving between embassies, you pick up languages out of necessity. And when your parents expect you to be a cultural bridge in every country you live in, you learn them well. Sheikh Al-Mansouri set the photograph down carefully. What happened? How did you go from that to? He gestured toward the cleaning company logo on my jacket. I pulled out more documents from the portfolio. Letters of recommendation from ambassadors, commendations for cultural liaison work, certificates from language institutes. The paper trail of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. I was working at the State Department, I said. Cultural attaché position. Liaison work between American businesses and Middle Eastern governments. I was good at it. Really good. I understood the cultural nuances, the business protocols, the ways that language could make or break international negotiations. And then? Then I met Robert. I smiled despite the pain that always came with his memory. He was an accountant from Ohio who was in D.C. for a training program. He was kind, stable, completely different from the diplomatic world I'd grown up in. When we got married, I thought I could have both, the career and the simple life he offered. Sheikh Al-Mansouri waited patiently as I gathered my thoughts. For a while I did. We moved to Chicago, and I got a position with a consulting firm that specialized in international business development. I was their Middle East specialist, helping American companies navigate cultural expectations when they wanted to expand into Arab markets. But then David was born, and Robert wanted me to step back from traveling, from the demanding schedule. "That's not unusual," he said gently. "No, it's not. And I was happy to make that compromise, at least temporarily." I shifted to part-time consulting, working mostly on document translation and cultural briefings. But then Robert was killed in that car accident, and everything fell apart. I told him about the financial devastation, about taking the first job I could find just to keep David and me housed and fed, about how the professional contacts I'd built slowly drifted away as I missed networking events and conference calls because I was working 3 minimum-wage jobs. The consulting firm was understanding at first, I said. They held my position for 6 months, hoping I'd find childcare and be able to return to the travel schedule. But I couldn't afford childcare on what they were offering, and I couldn't travel when I was barely keeping up with rent. "So you walked away from everything." "I had to choose," I said, my voice breaking slightly. David needed stability, needed me present, needed to know that no matter what else happened, I would be there for him. The international business world moves fast. If you're not constantly visible, constantly available, you become irrelevant very quickly. Sheikh Al-Mansouri leaned forward. "But you kept up with the languages. You stayed current with the cultural developments." I nodded toward the portfolio. I subscribed to Arabic newspapers, read French business journals at the library, watched international news broadcasts. I told myself it was just intellectual curiosity. But really, I think I was trying to hold on to pieces of who I used to be. "And your family never knew?" David was too young to understand what I'd given up. By the time he was old enough to ask detailed questions about my background, I'd been cleaning offices for so long that the diplomatic career felt like a story about someone else. I paused. It was easier to let him believe that this was all I'd ever been. Working-class mother who'd done her best with limited options. And when he met Meadow, the name still stung. Even in this safe space Sheikh Al-Mansouri had created, Meadow saw exactly what I'd trained her to see. Uneducated older woman with no professional experience, no social polish, no value to their upwardly mobile lifestyle. And honestly, after years of believing it myself, it was almost a relief to have someone confirm it. Sheikh Al-Mansouri was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents I'd spread across the coffee table. "Mrs. Sullivan, do you know why I asked you here today?" I shook my head. "Because I'm expanding my business operations into the American market, specifically targeting partnerships with companies that want to enter Middle Eastern markets. What I need, what I've been searching for months to find, is someone who understands both cultures deeply enough to navigate the complex business protocols and social expectations." He pulled out his own folder of documents. "I've interviewed dozens of consultants, people with impressive credentials and hefty hourly rates, but most of them have academic knowledge without real cultural fluency. They know the business terms but not the social nuances. They can translate words but not meaning. I don't understand. Last night, in 30 seconds of conversation, you demonstrated more practical knowledge of Arabic business culture than consultants I've paid thousands of dollars have shown me in hours of presentations." He leaned forward. "Mrs. Sullivan, I don't think you realize what you're worth." I stared at him, feeling like he was speaking a foreign language despite the fact that we were both speaking English. "I'm offering you a position," he said. "Cultural liaison and senior consultant for Al-Mansouri International's American expansion. The work would involve everything you used to do: cultural briefings, document translation, business protocol consulting, client relationship management." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I couldn't possibly. I haven't worked in that field for 20 years. I wouldn't even know where to start with modern business practices, current technology, contemporary cultural developments. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "culture doesn't change as quickly as technology does. The fundamental expectations of respect, relationship building, and cultural sensitivity that matter in Middle Eastern business are the same ones you understood 20 years ago. And frankly, your experience with struggle, with rebuilding your life from nothing, with maintaining dignity in difficult circumstances, those are exactly the qualities I need in someone who's going to represent my company." He named a salary figure that made me dizzy. It was more than I'd made in the last 5 years combined. "Think about it," he said, gathering his documents. "But don't think too long. I'm flying back to Dubai next week, and I'd like to have this position filled before I go." As I sat there in the elegant hotel lobby, surrounded by the remnants of my former life, I realized that Sheikh Al-Mansouri had given me something more valuable than a job offer. He'd given me back myself. I called Sheikh Al-Mansouri that evening and accepted his offer. The words felt foreign coming out of my mouth. Yes, I'd like to take the position, as if I were speaking someone else's lines in a play I'd never auditioned for. But the moment I hung up the phone, something inside me that had been dormant for 20 years began to stir back to life. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Sheikh Al-Mansouri had arranged for me to work with his legal team to review contracts and cultural protocols before his return to Dubai. I found myself back in conference rooms, but this time as the expert rather than the invisible presence in the corner. My first assignment was to review a partnership agreement with a tech company in Detroit that wanted to expand into Gulf markets. As I read through the contract, I noticed immediately that the American lawyers had structured the deal in a way that would be deeply offensive to traditional Arab business sensibilities. They'd prioritized speed and efficiency over relationship building, included penalty clauses that implied distrust, and scheduled meetings during times that conflicted with prayer schedules. "This won't work," I told Sheikh Al-Mansouri during our video conference. "They're approaching this like a domestic deal, but in Dubai, business is personal. You don't just sign contracts with companies. You build relationships with families, with people who need to trust you across generations." "Exactly," he said, and I could see the satisfaction in his expression. "Can you draft recommendations for restructuring the approach?" I spent the next 2 days writing a comprehensive cultural brief that outlined not just what needed to change in the contract language, but why those changes mattered. I explained the importance of relationship-building dinners, the significance of including families in business discussions, the cultural weight of certain phrases and gestures that could make or break negotiations. When I sent the document to Sheikh Al-Mansouri, his response was immediate. "This is precisely what I've been looking for. You've just saved me months of relationship repair that would have been necessary if we'd proceeded with their original approach." The Detroit deal became my template. Over the following weeks, I reviewed contracts for companies in telecommunications, manufacturing, and hospitality. Each one required a different cultural approach, different sensitivity to regional business practices, different understanding of how American directness translated, or failed to translate, in Arab business contexts. But the real test came when Sheikh Al-Mansouri asked me to accompany him to a preliminary meeting with the CEO of a pharmaceutical company that wanted to establish distribution partnerships in the Middle East. It was my first face-to-face business meeting in 20 years, and I was terrified. "Mrs. Sullivan," Sheikh Al-Mansouri said as we rode the elevator to the 32nd floor of the downtown office building, "I want you to observe today. Don't feel pressured to contribute unless you see something that concerns you from a cultural perspective." The meeting started predictably. The pharmaceutical CEO, a man named Richards, launched into an aggressive presentation about market penetration, profit margins, and timeline expectations. He spoke about Middle Eastern markets like they were territories to be conquered rather than communities to be served. I watched Sheikh Al-Mansouri's body language grow more reserved as Richards continued. The cultural disconnect was obvious to me, but Richards seemed oblivious to the growing tension in the room. 20 minutes into the presentation, Richards made a comment that made my blood run cold. "Of course, we'll need to streamline the approval process in your countries. American pharmaceutical standards are obviously more rigorous than what these developing markets are used to." I saw Sheikh Al-Mansouri's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. In that moment, I knew the deal was dead. But Richards had no idea he'd just insulted the educational background, professional competence, and cultural sophistication of some of the most advanced medical systems in the world. "Mr. Richards," I said quietly, "might I suggest a different perspective on the regulatory landscape?" Both men turned to me, and I felt the familiar flutter of nerves that came with stepping into professional territory I hadn't occupied in decades. But as I began to speak, muscle memory took over. The pharmaceutical approval processes in countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are actually among the most stringent in the world, I said. The regulatory agencies there often require additional safety studies beyond FDA approval, particularly for medications that will be used in populations with different genetic markers or environmental factors than those in American test groups. Richards looked confused, but Sheikh Al-Mansouri leaned forward with interest. "Additionally," I continued, "the medical communities in these countries are incredibly sophisticated. Many of the physicians have trained at institutions like Johns Hopkins, Harvard Medical School, and the Mayo Clinic. They're not looking for simplified American solutions. They're looking for partnerships that recognize their expertise and address their specific patient population's needs." I went on to explain the cultural importance of relationship-based business development in pharmaceutical partnerships, the significance of long-term commitment over quick market entry, and the ways that American companies could demonstrate respect for local medical traditions while introducing innovative treatments. By the end of my 15-minute explanation, the entire dynamic of the meeting had shifted. Richards was asking thoughtful questions instead of making assumptions, and Sheikh Al-Mansouri was discussing potential partnerships instead of looking for polite ways to end the conversation. After the meeting, as we waited for the elevator, Sheikh Al-Mansouri turned to me with a smile I'd never seen from him before. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, "that was remarkable. You didn't just prevent a cultural disaster. You created an opportunity for genuine partnership." "I was terrified the entire time," I admitted. "It didn't show. You spoke with the authority of someone who truly understands both worlds." He paused as the elevator arrived. "I have a proposition for you." As we rode down, he outlined his vision for expanding my role. Instead of just consulting on individual contracts, He wanted me to develop a comprehensive cultural training program for American companies seeking Middle Eastern partnerships. He envisioned seminars, workshops, and ongoing consultation services that would bridge the cultural gap that killed so many potentially successful business relationships. "The demand is enormous," he said. "I get calls every week from American companies that have failed in Middle Eastern markets because they didn't understand the cultural requirements. And I hear from Arab businesses that are frustrated with American partners who seem more interested in quick profits than sustainable relationships." The salary he proposed for this expanded role was staggering. More money than I'd ever imagined earning, enough to change my life completely. But more than the money, he was offering me the chance to do work that mattered, work that used every skill I'd developed and every experience I'd survived. "There's one condition," he said as we reached the lobby. My heart sank slightly, waiting for the catch that would make this dream evaporate. "You'll need to travel," he said. "Not constantly, but regularly. Meetings in Dubai, cultural immersion trips for American executives, relationship-building visits with potential partners. It would mean being away from Chicago several times a year." I thought about my small apartment, my quiet life, my predictable routine of cleaning jobs and occasional phone calls from David when he needed something. "When would you need an answer?" I asked. "Take the weekend," he said. "But Mrs. Sullivan, I hope you'll say yes. You're exactly what this business needs. And frankly, I think this business might be exactly what you need too." That evening, I sat in my apartment looking at the employment contract Sheikh Al-Mansouri had given me. The title read, Senior Cultural Consultant and Business Development Specialist. My name would be on business cards again, on letterhead, on contracts that would shape international partnerships. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't just surviving. I was on the verge of thriving. The only question was whether I had the courage to say yes to the life I'd thought was lost forever. I signed the contract on Monday morning and gave my 2 weeks' notice to the cleaning company that afternoon. My supervisor, Mrs. Chen, looked at me with such genuine surprise that I realized how completely I'd hidden my capabilities from everyone around me. "Maureen," she said, "I had no idea you had this kind of background. Why didn't you ever say anything?" "I guess I forgot who I used to be," I told her. And for the first time, that felt like the truth. The next 6 months transformed my life in ways I hadn't imagined possible. I moved from my small apartment to a comfortable condo with actual office space where I could work from home between travels. I bought professional clothes that fit properly, got my hair styled by someone other than myself, and slowly remembered how to carry myself like someone who belonged in boardrooms and business dinners. The work was everything Sheikh Al-Mansouri had promised. I developed cultural training seminars that American companies used to prepare for Middle Eastern expansion. I reviewed contracts and business proposals, traveled to Dubai quarterly to meet with potential partners, and slowly built a reputation as someone who could bridge cultural gaps that had stymied other consultants. But the most satisfying part was watching American business executives discover that successful international partnerships required more than just good products and competitive pricing. They needed to understand that in Arab business culture, trust was built over shared meals and family stories, that decisions were made through consensus and relationship rather than aggressive negotiation, that respect for tradition and patience with process were more valuable than speed and efficiency. I was in Dubai for a 3-day conference when I got the phone call that changed everything between David and me forever. "Mom," his voice sounded strained, almost panicked. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." I was in my hotel room, reviewing notes for the next day's presentation to a group of American healthcare executives. "What's wrong, David?" "Meadow saw an article about you in International Business Weekly. It said you were advising Fortune 500 companies on Middle Eastern market development, that you speak 7 languages fluently, that you have decades of experience in diplomatic and international business relations." His voice cracked slightly. "Mom, is that true?" I set down my pen and walked to the window overlooking Dubai's glittering skyline. "Yes, it's true. But you're a cleaning lady. You never went to college. You always said you didn't have any professional skills." "No, David," I said gently. "I never said those things." other people said them, and I stopped correcting them. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I don't understand," he said finally. "Why would you let us think? Why would you let Meadow treat you like someone who didn't matter? Like someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you threw my way?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended, carrying 20 years of swallowed hurt. "Mom, I never meant for her to—" "Yes, you did, David. Maybe not consciously. But you let her diminish me because it was easier than defending me. It was easier to be embarrassed by your mother than to ask questions about who I really was." I could hear him crying on the other end of the line, and despite everything, my heart ached for him. "I need you to understand something," I continued, my voice softening. "I don't blame you for not knowing my background. You were 6 when your father died, and I made the decision to focus on survival rather than preserving my professional identity. But I do blame you for not caring enough to ask who I was underneath the circumstances." "What can I do?" he whispered. "How can I fix this?" "You can't," I said simply. "Not the years of dismissal, not the humiliation, not the way you stood by while Meadow treated me like hired help at family gatherings. But you can decide how you want to move forward." When I returned to Chicago the following week, David was waiting for me at the airport. He looked older somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance. "Mom," he said as I collected my luggage, "I've been thinking about everything you said. About how I let Meadow treat you. About how I never asked the right questions." I studied his face, looking for signs of genuine understanding versus guilt-driven remorse. "I want to know," he continued. "I want to know about your life before I was born, about what you gave up, about who you really are, and I want to make sure Meadow understands that she owes you an apology." "David," I said, "I don't need Meadow's apology. Apologies from people like her are just words designed to make them feel better about their behavior. What I need is for you to understand that I've rebuilt my life, and it's a good life. I'm not the same person who used to clean offices and apologize for taking up space." 6 months later, I was back at the Marriott for another business conference, but this time I was the keynote speaker. My presentation was about cultural intelligence in international business development, and the audience included many of the same people who had witnessed Meadow's humiliation of me 2 years earlier. I saw her in the audience during my speech, sitting near the back with David. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable as I discussed the importance of recognizing value in unexpected places, of understanding that expertise comes in many forms, and that successful business leaders learn to see past surface appearances to identify real capability. After my presentation, as I was accepting congratulations from other attendees, Meadow approached me. She looked smaller somehow, less commanding than I remembered. "Maureen," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I wanted to congratulate you on your success." "Thank you," I replied politely, the way I might thank a stranger for holding a door. "I also wanted to say that I may have misjudged your background and capabilities. I hope we can move past any misunderstandings." I looked at her for a long moment, remembering the woman who had told me to grab a broom and find real work, who had humiliated me in front of strangers for the crime of not having the right credentials on paper. "Meadow," I said finally, "there's no misunderstanding to move past. You saw exactly who you wanted to see, and you treated me exactly how you thought someone like that deserved to be treated. The only difference now is that my circumstances have changed in ways that make it harder for you to dismiss me." Her carefully composed expression cracked slightly. "What I've learned," I continued, "is that respect shouldn't be conditional on someone's job title or bank account. The fact that you're willing to treat me differently now says more about your character than it does about my worth." I turned to leave, then paused. "I hope you'll remember this the next time you meet someone who doesn't fit your definition of valuable. They might surprise you." As I walked away, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because I'd gotten revenge or proven anyone wrong, but because I'd finally stopped caring what they thought of me. 3 years later, I was sitting in my home office, reviewing proposals from companies that wanted to hire my consulting firm, when David called. "Mom," he said, "I have some news. Meadow and I are getting divorced." I wasn't surprised. Success had taught me to recognize authenticity, And their marriage had never been built on anything real. "I'm sorry, David," I said, and I meant it. Not sorry that the marriage was ending, but sorry for the pain he was experiencing. "Actually," he said, "I'm not. I've been thinking a lot about what real partnership looks like, about what it means to support someone through difficult times rather than just celebrating them when they're successful. Meadow never learned how to do that. And what does that mean for you now?" "It means I want to learn how to be the kind of person who sees value in people regardless of their circumstances. It means I want to be someone you can be proud of, even if it's too late to undo the damage I've done." I looked out my office window at the city where I'd rebuilt my life, where I'd remembered who I was and discovered who I could become. "It's never too late to choose who you want to be, David," I said. I'm living proof of that. Today, I run a successful consulting firm that helps companies navigate international business relationships with cultural sensitivity and genuine respect. I travel regularly, speak at conferences, and work with clients who value my expertise, not because of my credentials, but because of my results. I never did get that college diploma that Meadow thought was so important, but I learned something more valuable, that worth isn't determined by other people's recognition, and that the most powerful transformation happens when you stop asking for permission to be who you really are. Sometimes I think about that night at the conference when Meadow told me to grab a broom and find real work. She was right about one thing. I did need to find real work. I just needed to remember that I'd been qualified for it all along. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.